Of War and Love by Joe Quackenboss. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. In this historic romance, a young duke strives for peace, independence, and maybe love in the vapid society of 19th century England. When Alexander Washburn was recalled from the campaigns in Spain to take up his family's seat at Richmond, he never knew that love was on the horizon for him. With his new position as Duke of Richmond, it is expected that he finds a wife to carry on his family line. However, Alex has seen the very darkness of men's souls and suffers from the experience. Is it possible for love to heal a war-torn heart? Chapter 1. Lieutenant! Alexander Washburn pointed over his subordinate's shoulder at the storm of horsemen charging down the rain-soaked hillside towards them. "4th Company of the line! Reform! Square formation! On the double! Quick!" Alex fell back as the regiment formed up into a box, the flag-bearer, lieutenant, and drummer beside him in the center and protected on all sides by the rest of the company. Nearby, he could hear similar commands being called out as the Imperial cuirassiers drew ever closer. "Brace for cavalry charge! Bayonets!" In perfect order, his company affixed their bayonets, the first rank bracing their rifles against the ground for use as makeshift pikes. Suddenly before them, a pair of howitzer shells ripped through the lines, sending many of his men to the ground as the screams of the dying screeched through the air. With that distraction, however, the French punched through the gaping hole. "Fire!" Alex called, knowing it was already too late. The second rank fired over the heads of their comrades as the horsemen tore into their lines, sabers flashing down into red-coated men. Then the 4th Company's formation collapsed. The lieutenant to his right went down, slashed from shoulder to navel. An armored cuirassiers reared his war horse and charged the flag-bearer. Alex took aim and fired his flintlock, but the oncoming animal crashed into them regardless. May 1814, Lennox House, London. Alex awoke, panting and gasping for air. Instantly upon him as he returned to reality were the loud, busy noises of the city. "God, I hate London." Muttering, he ran a hand across a sweat-soaked face. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a man in the London season is in want of a wife. However, little knew the feelings or views of such a man on his first entering London. This truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters, that they will gladly remind him of his true intentions and desires. Thus the London air buzzed with excitement on this dawn. In a matter of weeks, London shops and cafes would be bursting at the seams, modistes being called from home to home, and the opera and theatre diligently practicing, eagerly awaiting its opening nights. Yet Alexander Washburn hated the night, for it was in the night that he dreamt about his time in Spain and Portugal. He could still hear the screams of agony and smell the blood soaking into worn earth. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the mangled and detached limbs of the fallen. He remembered the look on the faces of dead men whose mouths still hung open in silent screams, and whose eyes had never closed, but still registered the shock and brief pain of being wounded before falling to the earth to die. It was these nights that he would come to one of the vacant rooms with naught but the bottle, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy. This bedroom was hardly ever used, and it was far enough away from the other occupants that any noise he may have been induced to make would be quelled by the distance. Briefly, he closed his eyes, willing the sounds of merriment to vacate his mind, so his sleep may still return. Yet in that silence, The cannon fire was deafening, and the screams of agony and terror almost drowned them out. He remembered the horse crashing into him, and as he struggled to get up, slipping on a combination of mud and blood. He had been covered in blood, and yet given his red uniform, you would have never known it but for the darker outlines staining the coat. It was the snapping of a twig which caused him to whirl around in concealed terror. "Get away from me!" he shouted into the darkness of a vacant room. "Get away from me!" Sleep was not to come to him. The alcohol consumed earlier may have numbed his body, but images of battle and destruction kept him tossing and turning. It would appear that he was to never have peace, even with the aid of alcohol. Rising from the bed, he strode to the nightstand and grabbed the whiskey. Uncorking the bottle, he took a quick swallow before setting it down again. This was the terror of man's heart. His memories of war haunted his slumber and sought to draw him back into that snare of blood and battle. The sunlight shone from behind the drawn window curtains, creating a mysterious appearance by the shadows which seemed to be at play with the light beams. But it suited Alex's mood just fine. He picked up the whiskey and took another long drink as he stood in front of the window and stared into the shadow. If only he could be as free to move as the darkness seemed to be. Suddenly, the bottle didn't seem so appealing, but he continued to drink anyways. He would allow himself this one last moment of weakness, in hopes that he would be rested enough and strong enough. Silent tears of frustration fell down his face as he finally corked the bottle. He just wanted to be free of this nightmare. Please, God, just let me be myself again. Placing the bottle back, he quickly undressed and moved to the wash chamber. Today would be a new day. The war was behind him, and he would have to change himself, just as his name had so recently changed. Standing at the mirror, Alex stared at his heavy, dark, saggy excuse for a face. His manservant, Malcolm, entered the dressing-room carrying 2 waistcoats, one of which he would don for this day. "The green or the blue, sir?" Not even Malcolm's kind smile was enough to rid him of his bleak mood. "I care not which," he answered shortly. Sleep had almost completely eluded him, and as a result his visage appeared limp and lifeless, and his eyes, normally his most animated feature when others were present, could not be called to shine for even his own self. With a sigh, Alex examined the heavy skin under his eyelids. He had never been worried about his appearance before, but now, with the idea of turning over a new leaf, he could not help but care how he looked, or rather, how he looked to others. Was he a fool for thinking so? Yes, he decided, as he turned from his reflection in disgust. He was a fool for being so vain, and sometimes, he thought, a fool for being the wretch of a man he was. Normally, Alex's self-esteem was not so low. He was undeniably a very anxious man, a very unconfident, self-despising man. Ever since he was a young lad, growing up as the second son of an entirely too powerful man, he had been so insecure and so unsure of himself. Now those wretched emotions he had fought years to subdue renewed themselves tenfold. Sympathetic as always of his distress, Malcolm appeared to not take offence at Alex's bluntness. "Perhaps the blue, sir," Malcolm offered, "for I know you favour blue. What I favour, what I do not favour, it is all for naught." Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on Alex's shoulder. Unlike most gentlemen and respected valets, Alex and Malcolm had not only man-servant relations, but friendly relations as well. Alex was not afraid to speak of personal matters to his servant, and Malcolm was always willing to listen and ready to assist. "I am a fool, Malcolm." Alex agonized with a sigh. The servant responded with a shake of his head. "Come, come, sir. You are no fool. You are a very intelligent man. If you are a fool, you are only a fool for fooling yourself into thinking you're a fool. Alex raised a confused brow. If you are a fool, you are only a fool. Forgive me for talking in riddles, sir. I merely meant to assure you that you are very bright indeed. Alex gave him an incredulous look as he turned to face the mirror once more. That was it. He was done. He was done allowing the snares of old memory and nightmares control him. Finished giving in to the temptation of drink. Good God, he was naked in a tub thinking about whiskey. Had there ever been anything less gentlemanly? He had never been this type of man, and if he didn't stop wanting what he couldn't have, he would begin to go after it anyway. Gentlemanliness be damned. No, he would finally return to his regular purpose in life, doing the proper thing, the wise thing, and the responsible thing. You are quite correct, Malcolm. I must find a reason to move on. Very good, sir. After his shave and the additional little accoutrements of the morning, Alex reviewed the coats Malcolm had laid out for him. Grey, Alex thought, removing the fine coat on the left. Yes, that would fit his mood nicely. Once he was presentable, Alex sat in the study of the London house, a townhouse he would love to smash to bits with a sledgehammer, if he could, rearranging the bits of ham on his breakfast plate. He was far too flustered about that stupid dream, but for the life of him he could not focus on his breakfast for thinking of it. After a good 5 minutes of staring at his plate, Alex abandoned his food and reverted his attention to checking and rechecking estate finances, crop production, and tenant care. Paper, paper, and more paper. This would become his normal existence, and by now he should be accustomed to one such. Yet this regular state of solitary confinement now left him feeling drained of all life. He glanced at his reflection in a looking-glass, and for a moment, and again reminded himself he needed to turn over a new leaf. With that thought, he sensed a shadow of a smile cross his face. He told himself it was a flight of the imagination, a fancy brought on by self-pity. However, he could not deny the hope he felt pulsating inside of him, yearning to break free of his book-lined prison, to seek passion and purpose. This being the London season, he knew that many a mother and daughter would be on the search for a man just like he. Perhaps that was why he felt the need to appear presentable. Yet spending the season here in London sounded about as enjoyable as another campaign on the peninsula with Wellington. This was not a new thought for Alex. He had long ago come upon the realization that he never could love, that he never would love. However, that realization, rather than making him downcast, had simply left him feeling bland and useless. Yes, the times had changed. A match was required of a man like he, especially now. But what was a match without love? Being the second son, he had never been one to dream of, or even to anticipate a match, let alone that said match would lead to love. Love had always been for the poor and the weak, not men with £100,000 per annum to carry over their backs. Yet suddenly the word love, it had taken on a new translation. It was for the man lucky enough to catch love within the grasp of his socially approved match. It brought joy to whoever was lucky enough to receive it, and it made fortunate the children who were lucky enough to be born of parents who truly loved one another, just as Alex had been. What was the use of his life if he could not love another? To feel nothing? It seemed almost a crime against God, failing to react with passion toward the life he'd been given. But he did feel nothing. As he went on with task after task, there in his ominously large, lonely study, he could not love this life, or even imagine that he should be so. The thought decided matters. Staying in London would be out of the question. But where could he go? He could always return to Goodwood House in West Sussex. His sister would be particularly happy to see him. Instead, he found himself going through that very morning's post. An old friend's letter in particular had been very interesting, and it seemed to call to him from among the stacks. They had shared much correspondence over the years, yet had been unable to see each other since their time spent at Sandhurst. Unlike himself, the Earl of Surrey had never gone on campaign. He had used his time at the Sandhurst Academy for a military education. Being the first son did have its advantages, and Adam Watchtower was not one to disappoint in that regard. He had even purchased another home for himself, the topic of his most recent correspondence. "You must come visit Clarendon Park, and tell me what you think of it," it read. "Escape from London for a bit." "You must escape, then?" Escape. Yes. Yes, escape was precisely what he needed, for with all the changes in his life, Alex knew that this would be the perfect time to escape London and the social season. Ha! Would not the London mothers be so disappointed that the newly raised Duke of Richmond would not be present this season? Chapter 2. "Alexander, by God, man, you are soaked to the skin." Watchtower instantly called for a servant to remove Alex's sopping wet coat. "I had not expected you to arrive so soon, Alexander." So soon? There was not soon enough to get away from London. "Well, it was no trouble at all, Watchtower. I wanted to see you as soon as possible." Alex lied. Actually, it had been an immense amount of trouble making sure everything was prepared for his unexpected flight. And, truthfully, seeing Watchtower could have been postponed a day or two. But Alex was too good a friend to tell him that. Watchtower looked out the window, shaking his head in discontent. Blasted rain! Although Alex could not agree with Watchtower's statement, he turned his gaze to the window as well and grumbled some affirmative. Despite some terrible memories of the mud and rain from his time on the peninsula, he quite liked rain. He believed it to be a sort of miracle, water falling from the sky. Naturally, anyone who heard this opinion believed him to be insane, especially those blasted society females who would remark in a vain attempt to entice him, "Oh, the weather is so very disagreeable, is it not, Your Grace?" Damn them. Well, he did not normally wish to curse in reference to women, but if they were men, damn them. "Richmond?" Watchtower's call broke Alex from his reverie. "Don't just stand here, Richmond. Go change. All that water is making a puddle on my floor," he yelled with a teasing laugh. Alex smiled at his young friend and began to climb the staircase. Watchtower had always had a way of bringing out the best in him. If there was any man in the world who could undoubtedly make him smile, it was Watchtower. "Are you up for going out tonight, Alexander?" The smile instantly fell as he stopped midway up the flight. Out? Going out where? "Well," Watchtower cautiously began as he nervously twiddled his fingers. "Cordelia and Lavinia and I were to attend the assembly tonight, but I know how you dislike such things. If you do not wish to go, I must stay here with you, of course, which I will not mind too much, seeing as you are my dearest friend. But if you should choose to go, the more the merrier, I say." This had all been said so quickly and recklessly that at first Alex could not distinguish one word from another. But the word assembly stood out. Alexander Washburn, 4th Duke of Richmond, was terrible at assemblies. He was terrible at any social gathering, really, but especially at assemblies. At an assembly there were too many people to ignore everyone, and too little people to fade into the background unnoticed. And no one wanted him there. They didn't want him there just as much as he didn't want himself there. Alex was convinced. But if he did not go, Watchtower would not go, and then Watchtower would be disappointed, which would make him disappointed, and then they would all be disappointed. He might as well be back in London. Therefore, Alex reluctantly replied, "Yes, of course, my friend. I would be happy to join you. Just for my own sake, let us keep my new status to ourselves." "But of course, your grace," the Earl of Surrey grinned. "You shall be but Major Washburn." With that, he continued his climb and retreated to his room, where he could change from his soaked travelling clothes and dress for this assembly ball, and wonder with regret what he'd done. By the time they arrived at the assembly, he knew exactly what he'd done. Good God, it was almost as bad as London. Despite no announcement or recognition of him or their party, the clothing they wore screamed money. Of course, those present knew the Earl on sight, and his black coat over a maroon vest was a statement in contrast. While his sister, Miss Cordelia, was stunning in burgundy, and her cousin, the Mrs. Lavinia, wore dark blue, Alex had chosen his customary grey coat, white for the trousers, all lined in dark silks. At his breast was the small badge of his regiment. "Come, Alexander," said Watchtower. "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not," he heard himself reply in a condescending tone. "You know how I detest the crowds." He paused and closed his eyes briefly before continuing. "Plus, there is not a woman in the room who I would wish to set my eyes upon. Why would I wish a punishment to her and myself to offer false promise as they stand up with—" "Mark me, Alexander," Watchtower interrupted. "I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life. There is no harm in a dance." "I suppose, Watchtower. I do say you are dancing with one of the most handsome in attendance this night." He discreetly glanced at Miss Melanson Marquis, Watchtower's obsession for the night. "Yes, and there is one of her sisters sitting down behind you. Come, at least meet the girl." Alex turned in the direction of Watchtower's nod. At the very least, Watchtower had allowed him to attend with none of the ceremony due his title and station, so perhaps he should at least converse, just for a moment or two. "Yes, if I must," Alex finally conceded. Watchtower smiled in victorious delight. "Come, my dear," he motioned to Miss Melanson. "Introduce my most unsociable friend here to your lovely sister." They cut through the gathering rather quickly, yet Alex felt heat building in his chest and a dotting of perspiration on his forehead. Crowds were never something he relished, and despite this being a rather jolly affair with cheerful music, the bustling and jostling of people were making him feel downright heated with anxiety. The dancers on the floor spun about in merriment. The musicians played a lively tune. Yet it was the room that suddenly began to spin, the heat travelling up his neck to flush his face. He felt Watchtower's hand touch his arm, and heard his friend's words. "Madame, may I present an old friend of mine from Sandhurst, Major Alexander Washburn, most recently of Her Majesty's Coldstream Regiment, serving under Wellington in Spain." Alex focused his attention on the here and now, pushing aside the rising heat. A darkly golden head bobbed before him. "Major," she curtsied, "I am Miss Rose Marquis." She appeared absolutely radiant, a sparkling ray of enchantment amidst the crowded ballroom, entranced by the flicker of candlelight. The light reflected in her aquamarine eyes like a fire burning, and if he could, he would carry her out of the blasted assembly hall and take her for a walk, a drive, a ride, a swim, whatever, so long as he could be with her away from the eyes of this idiotic town. "Miss Rose, it is a rare A loud crash from some guests falling into a table, and in turn splintering it, caused Alex to stiffen and stop abruptly. His eyes slammed shut, and he was instantly taken back to his time in Spain. The rational part of him knew he was in England and safe, but the other part of him had associated the noise with something truly dreadful. It was imperative he leave, though, so the rest of society did not have to see how broken he had become. He opened his eyes, took a calming breath, and turned from the room without another word. Behind he heard the brash words of Miss Melanson and Miss Rose at the rude behaviour of a so-called gentleman, but that was the least of his worries now. He reached an empty hall and leaned his head forward against the wall. Sweat drenched his brow. "Alexander," he heard Watchtower say from just behind him, "are you well, my friend?" "I will recover. I apologize for my behaviour. Watchtower, enjoy your evening. I shall take my leave of you." Before his friend could say another word, Alex had left the assembly hall, already knowing tonight would not be a good night for the dreams. He awoke some hours later. Now he stared at the ceiling above him, contemplating all that had occurred at the assembly. It was all a blur, really. The disregarding, the silencing, all mixed together in his mind as one big, indistinct plan to keep everyone and everything away from him for as long as possible, while he attempted to turn over this second leaf on life. One part of his intricate, highly strategic plan was to distract Watchtower. He was one of those happy, peppy social people who kindly assumed that the rest of the world's population wished to be happy and peppy and social with him, even when they didn't. Therefore, it was an absolute necessity that he distracts his friend as often and as much as possible. If he didn't succeed, he was forced to calmly and politely get Watchtower to leave him alone. Otherwise, he would soon find himself the night's entertainment for a speculating circle of Guildford savages. Step 1 was to answer in negatives. I shall not, there is not, she is not, I cannot, etc. Step 2 was to offer some final, firm farewell and be done with it forever. That was truly all it had been in Alex's mind. In normal circumstances, it would be less than nothing, and he would not be able to recall 3 of his own words. But these were not normal circumstances. His behaviour before Miss Rose, even now, were rattling about in his guilty brain, haunting him. His promise to turn over a new leaf was somehow ruined now. He had allowed his past to interrupt his present, and he positively abhorred the actions he had taken, even the words he had stated prior to the meeting Miss Rose. There is not a woman in the room who I would wish to set my eyes upon. Though Miss Melanson Marquis was beautiful, he had never cared for the prim, delicate, English rose type of woman, and his declaration that there was no woman in the room whom he would set his eyes upon. In reality, there was one in particular who would be the only one to garner his glance. And then she was offered to him. She was in his reach. Watchtower could introduce him. And then came the worst action of all. He had fled. He had fled before, trifling little flights to reorganize or take more tempting a position. But this had been a full-blown retreat, and was, of course, a capital sin. Had he run at Sabugal when the French had charged him? Had he retreated in any other of the 19 pitched battles? The answer was simple, was it not? No, not once had he fled from anything in his life, yet now he had tempted fate with an ill-conceived notion of bettering himself. Fate. Nay, she had been tempting him all night. He could still remember every detail of her beautiful eyes, large, bright, and inviting, glowing with something he could not name, with long eyelashes that fluttered against her pale cheeks when she closed them. They were enough to make a man go mad. Good God, he was going mad. Even worse, he was beginning to sound like Watchtower. He would think of her no more, no more. "Your Grace, you are looking quite well this morning." "Am I?" Alex longed to reply, because I feel like hell." Seeing the look of shock on Miss Watchtower's face at his use of the word hell would have been enough to lighten his spirits. He might have even felt like laughing rather than yawning. God, how he wished he could have fallen back asleep last night. Slowly he returned his attention to the simpering smiles of Cordelia Watchtower. What on earth had he been thinking, leaving a hive of desperate single women in London for an audience with the Queen Bee? "You are looking quite well this morning, indeed." "Your Grace?" "Oh, He quickly seated himself at the breakfast table. "I am well, Cordelia, thank you." Naturally, they were the only two at the table. She had undoubtedly planned it all in advance, what she would wear, what they would eat, whether she wished the curtains to be opened or closed. He could see it all, her sitting on her little vanity chair at 3 this morning, just to ensure that she would not be late, dressed and decorated perfectly for a breakfast for 2. Now she was fluttering her thin little eyelashes at him. It was enough to make him vomit, and he had not even eaten yet. He rose from his chair as quickly as he had sat in it. "Actually, I believe I will go for a walk this morning."
"Oh."
Her attempted but most definitely unsuccessful provocative smile instantly faded.
"Oh, well then."
It seemed, Alex mused in triumph, that she had failed. But then the simpering smile and eyelashes of doom returned.
"Well then, allow me to accompany you."
"Oh, no. You mustn't do that. I believe Adam wished to discuss the partridge with you." Damn blasted, did he just say partridge? To hell with what he said. Now was the time for another retreat. And he did retreat, right out of the breakfast room, out the front door, and away, without bothering to don a greatcoat or hat or gloves. Partridge. He would certainly need to develop a Cordelia Watchtower strategy, and soon. How long had he been walking now? 2, 3 hours? It had to be at least 8 by now. Perhaps he should thank Cordelia and her eyelashes for scaring him off to the outdoors. The exercise had improved his mood greatly, and he was no longer fatigued. He did not even care that the air was growing cold, and he was without a greatcoat. He felt wonderful. Who would have thought that Miss Watchtower could ever cause him to feel wonderful? Suddenly, from the grove of trees came a burst of feminine laughter. Curiosity got the better of Alex, and he slowly crept toward the noise, conveniently hidden by the large branches of an oak tree.
Katie, pick that one over there." "I don't like that one, you pick it." "No, you." The 2 young ladies arguing, he vaguely recalled from the assembly, but he could not place a name with their faces. By the look of them, they were very young and very silly. "But I do not want to pick that one."
The girl, apparently named Katie, whined. The loud burst of laughter Alex had previously heard was heard once again, but he could not see from whom it came. Slowly he changed his hiding place and peered from behind another tree with a better view. The laughter had come from none other than Rose. Miss Rose. Miss Rose, stood from her spot in the grass where Miss Melanson had been placing flowers in her hair, and took the hands of the silly girls whom Alex now remembered as being her younger sisters. How were such charming ladies as Rose, Miss Rose, and Miss Melanson in the same family, let alone the same county as these 2? "Come," Rose, Miss Rose, said to them as she bit her lip so as not to laugh. "Why not pick it together? Put one hand on one leaf, one hand on the other, and pray that it does not fall apart." Now she allowed herself to drown in mirth at the angered looks on the faces of her sisters.
"Rose, be serious,"
they yelled, but Rose, Miss Rose, simply continued to laugh as she spun about on the field.
"I,"
she giggled,
"am never serious when out of doors. Serious people frown, and I could never frown with so much beauty about." She only broke into laughter at the rolling of her sister's eyes. She had a beautiful laugh, really. It was not sweet and simple like a soft breeze, but loud and powerful, like a clap of thunder. A soft breeze is practically imperceptible. You cannot tell from where it came or where it went. But a clap of thunder is unmistakable. It will always, without question, strike something or other in the heart of its recipient. And that was precisely what Miss Rose's laugh was. He was absolutely enchanted by her laughter. It was contagious. He was in such great danger of revealing himself that he covered his mouth with his fist to keep from chuckling. Then, all of a sudden, the sky darkened, and there was a soft drizzle. Miss Katy and Miss Lillian, he believed her name was, were furious with Mother Nature for ruining their fun, and were set, it seemed, on staying out in the rain in order to reprimand her with wails of, "Oh, fiddlesticks!" and "This is simply not fair." Alex would have been forced to cover his ears, had not Miss Mellinson taken them by her matronly hands and led them away. But Miss Rose, did not follow. Instead, she rested her back against an oak tree. The exact oak tree Alex was hidden behind. "Rose," Miss Mellinson called, "are you not coming? You'll be soaked." "Leave me a while, Mellinson," she answered in a subdued voice. The closeness of her sent a lightning bolt through his senses. From this proximity he could smell the sweetness of her hair, hear her raspy breathing. She looked much like a goddess with the flowers entwined in her braided hair. And Alex suddenly had a strong impulse to softly pull them out, one by one by one. "Rose, you are being ridiculous," Miss Lillian yelled. "Why ever would you want to be out in this horrible weather?" "I quite like the rain," she answered. "It's quite like a miracle, isn't it? Water falling from the sky." All Alex could do was smile. He could have stayed there, watching her as she gazed dreamily at the sky, completely one with nature forever. Chapter 3. The sun shone brightly on his face as he walked under a canopy of trees. There was a hand on his arm, Rose's. She looked up into his eyes and smiled at him. They were doing nothing at all, and having a marvelous time doing it. They walked for miles and miles, talking and laughing. He asked her multiple questions about herself. What were her likes, her dislikes, her interests? Eventually there was a mutual agreement, not so much in their words, but perhaps in their eyes, or perhaps in something more profound, like their souls, that they no longer needed conversation. That being together was enough. Her pale skin and flowing white dress were a shimmering white light amidst the fallen leaves of autumn. She was quite a wonderful contrast to the dark shadow of London, he thought. They were running, circling around tree trunks and ducking under their branches. He hadn't run like this, simply for the fun of it, in years. Clearly it was far too long overdue. Suddenly he could laugh again, smile again, the way he used to when he was young, without the heavy weight of responsibility constantly on his shoulders. He was light and free, and he could very well run on and on and on, as long as Rose was alongside him. As they stopped in their running to breathe, he bent his head so that Rose's exhausted, yet invigorated face met his own. Each of their lips were formed into the brightest of smiles, and slowly those lips began to meet as he became physically, emotionally, spiritually closer and closer to every beautiful part of her. Rose. Their lips were about to touch. The heat and blast of the howitzer shell tore them apart. Damn it! He was awake. Hurriedly, Alex rose from the bed to look at himself in the glass. Perhaps it was for the best that he had awoken. Something almost wild was glowing in the light rings of his grey eyes, and he did not like it. But there was absolutely nothing to fret about. he firmly told himself. There was nothing wild in his eyes. He was just sleepy, that was all. All he was seeing was the effect falling asleep at 1 in the morning and reawakening at... He glanced at the clock. Good heavens, 3 in the morning. Yes, indeed, what an effect 3 in the morning had on him. Nothing to fret about. After all, he was sober at 3 in the morning, at the very least. Yet none of that did explain the dream itself. Alex could not lie, even to himself, and say the dream had meant nothing, or that he had felt nothing in having it. But an alliance with Rose... He had long since given up the effort of calling her Miss Rose in his mind, was simply impossible. She was of far too low a station to be met with compliance by those of his high station. Despite the fact he still saw himself as nothing more than an officer of the foot. High station be damned. After his little spying session behind the oak tree the previous morning, he had recalled this, and had made a strict resolve to think of her no longer. After all, where was the sense in pining for something he could never have? But clearly his subconscious had chosen to defy the decision, and instead chose to make its own decision to torture him with the pretty picture it had painted in his dreams tonight. But there was absolutely nothing to fret about. Dreams were only frilly nothings the mind makes up when it has nothing better to think of. And what did he really know about Rose? He had barely spoken to her at the assembly. He had never asked her what her likes were, her dislikes, her interests, as he had in his dream. Then he had gone and insulted her by leaving without a word. But damn and blast, how he secretly wished he could remember her answers. That is just the way of dreams, Alex's secretly pining heart mused, to have you forget the things you most want to remember. But of course, Alex ignored these secret thoughts and remained focused on the task at hand. In truth, he knew nothing at all about her. Perhaps that was the key. Engage her in conversation. Once he really talked to her, surely he would realize that she was no woman for him. He would be hospitably welcomed home by his former way of life, and she would be Miss Rose once more, although there was their mutual opinion of Rain to recommend her. Oh, Lord, he was doing it again, contradicting himself. He had never been prone to doing that before. What on earth was happening to him? It was the dreams. The dreams, the rain, the partridge. They were all against him, plotting to turn his entire way of life upside down, and he had had enough. He would put his plan into action at his first opportunity. All he would need was a strategy. The carriage made its way down the rocky pathways of Guildford. They were to attend a party at Littlefield Lodge tonight. Alex remembered the Littlefields from the assembly, especially Sir Gilbert Littlefield, the silly old man who would happily leave his wife to marry St. James's. If it were possible to marry a building, if he could indeed do such a thing, he would most assuredly hire a minister on the spot and search high and low for a ring large enough to fit his beloved cathedral, so passionately did he love it. Alex mentally filed the night under a long list of the dreaded things to come tonight. On the positive side of the situation, the list of things he hoped were to come tonight, there was only one thing on his mind: speaking to Rose. He only hoped to speak to her in order to rid her from his mind. Nothing at all to do with the turning of a new leaf, of course. Indeed, Sir Gilbert Littlefield's eldest daughter, Miss Adelaide Littlefield, and Rose were good friends, or at least that was what Alex presumed by their closeness at the assembly. Therefore, he deduced, Rose would most definitely attend. For days he had been plotting how their conversation would go, what he would say, how he would say it. But soon his imagination would take over, and he would find himself lost in a daydream rather than a plan, one completely contradictory to everything he had intended the talk to be. He may as well go over it once more in his mind, just in case. Rose. Blast it. Miss Rose. He bows. Major Washburn. She curtsies. It is certainly a lively party. Yes, it is. Would you care for some refreshment? That would be delightful, thank you, she answers with a smile. Here he would gallantly signal a servant, who would come and offer them what he carried on his tray. Sherry, most likely, although champagne would be far more sophisticated. Well, why not make it interesting? Champagne. After gallantly signaling the server, he gallantly offers her a glass of champagne, at which point she dazzles him with a smile and thanks him. And then, suddenly, the servant trips over the corner of a rug, spilling champagne all over her. Red, green, pink, yellow, violet, blue. Yes, he loved blue, all over her light blue dress. She is absolutely mortified, so what else is he to do but save her from her embarrassment by lifting her into his arms and carrying her outdoors and away from the party? He does so, causing a wave of desire to rush over him. When she rests her head on his shoulder, his pulse begins to pound violently within him at the thought of how perfectly they fit together. Once outside, he reluctantly lets her down and helps her back onto her feet. Her face is the deepest shade of red as she quietly thanks him for his service. He takes her hand and kisses it, saying that there is no cause for her to be embarrassed, and that he would always be happy to assist her. Her hand is so soft, so delicate, that he cannot resist the temptation of kissing it again, and again, and again, each time as slowly as he is able. Rose. He is about to kiss her neck. She is lifting her chin to allow him access. They are both locked in ecstasy, and then the carriage hit a large bump in the road and slammed his head against the roof. Ah, damn, blast it all! Upon re-entering reality, Alex was met with the wide eyes and confused faces of the rest of the Clarendon Park party. No doubt they were shocked. Alex was never prone to yelling, especially not so loudly. Alex struggled to find some sensible words to say while simultaneously fighting the urge to blush in humiliation. Forgive me, it hurt. The gaping mouths soon closed and returned to their fixed, polite smiles. Watchtower assured Alex that it was nothing, and he could not blame him, and he hoped he wouldn't find himself with a large bump on his head. But despite his friend's kindness, Alex turned his face away, holding his hand to his injured head, positively ashamed of himself, positively ashamed of his weakness. Firstly, because of his outburst. From youth, he had been taught to behave as a gentleman in all companies. Then, as an officer, he had been trained to maintain his calm and discipline under the most intense of circumstance. Yet here he was, screaming like a banshee and cursing in front of the family of his best friend. Secondly, he was ashamed of the fantasy he had just allowed himself to fall into. It had been as if he was under a spell, completely unable to think like a rational human being. He had even picked the color of her dress, for God's sake. And, good God, had he carried her out of the party? He was losing it. No, he was not losing it. He had already lost it. He was slowly and surely allowing himself to turn into a fool, but no more. All he had to do was follow the plan. It would be his new motto: follow the plan, 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 and follow the plan. And so he repeated this montage all the way to Littlefield Lodge. In the carriage, stepping out of the carriage, stepping into the house, it was follow the plan, follow the plan, follow the plan, follow the plan, until he saw Rose. Then it was, I hope they have champagne. It took what seemed like an eternity for him to be free of company. It was quite obvious that the 5 Marquis girls, though the younger ones were undeniably silly, were quite popular amongst the people of Guildford.
Rose had been constantly surrounded by a group of friends for quite some time, while Alex, not wishing to call any attention to himself, stood in a distant corner watching her, waiting for the opportune moment to approach. Now at last the time had come. The crowd of people that formerly encircled the prize had finally dispersed, and he was ready to greet her. Well, almost ready anyway. With determined strides, Alex left his corner and casually approached. Upon her recognizing him, she met his gaze, and he, trying with all his might to act as calm and natural as possible, gave a quick bow. Miss Rose." He could not tell by the look on her face whether she was amused or annoyed as she met his bow with a curtsy. "Major Washburn. He was beginning to lose his train of thought, and, damn it, his palms were sweating. "It is certainly a lively party." "Excellent. Follow the plan, and follow the plan." But was that scorn shining in her beautiful eyes? "Yes," she answered. "For some of us, I suppose it is." "What? Are you not enjoying yourself, Miss Marquis?" "Well, yes, I am. But I did not think it proper to suppose that you were enjoying yourself, Major Washburn. After all, the last event you attended you left without a second word. A Londoner such as yourself must be far worldlier to enjoy an affair as small and unimportant as this." She had smiled amiably throughout every word, and yet there was something in the tone of her voice, and in the way she looked at him with one brow raised, that was one part sinister, one part strangely arousing. Was she teasing him? He had never been teased in this way before. He couldn't decide whether he liked it or not, and he couldn't decide whether she liked him or not. It was as if she was both content and angry, and one emotion was simply a mask attempting to hide the other. But for the life of him he could not decipher which was the mask and which wasn't. Unfortunately, he had no time to decide or decipher anything before Rose quickly bobbed a curtsy. "If you will excuse me, Major Washburn," she stated with a smile he also could not decipher, "I must rejoin my sister." He had not even time to say that of course he understood, for she was already gone. Well, that had not gone precisely as he had hoped, but that was the difference between daydreams and reality. Then the ladies began to sing. It would have been very considerate of the Littlefields to mention that this was a never-ending party. He had probably been sitting in the same chair, barely drinking the same glass of sherry for an hour. Well, that was what it felt like anyway. And try as he might, he still could not get Rose's singing out of his mind. It had been a magnificent performance, one he was convinced he would never forget for as long as he lived. True, her pianoforte playing needed some work, but that could not affect the joy and love that rang through her lovely soprano voice. Though he reminded himself his musical talents were completely lacking, who exactly was he to judge? Whereas Miss Marissa Marquis's performance after her, though flawless, was solemn and emotionless. Rose's was full of vigor and life, and the way she smiled earnestly at her listeners was clear evidence that her only wish was to make them happy with her song. Slowly he rose from his seat in order to stretch his muscles and began to walk about the room. She was so different from the high society snobs he had gradually grown accustomed to in the London season. Everything the snobs did was done for their own benefit. All they wanted was credibility, and all they lived for was their pride. Rose was sweet, kind, generous, the exact opposite of everything the Tom loved, and Alex despised. Although he hadn't had the chance to learn more of her through conversation, he had been able to acquaint himself with her simply through observation. His results? She had proved herself to be everything that was kind and lovely. Lost as Alex was in his thoughts on Rose, he did not realize when he stopped in his walk that he was extremely close to the object of his current obsession. He may have noticed her presence far sooner than he did, had not his neighbour, Sir Gilbert Littlefield, unexpectedly demanded his attention. "What a charming amusement for young people this is, Your Grace," Sir Gilbert declared in an overly boisterous voice, gesturing toward the group of young people dancing. "There is nothing like dancing, after all. I consider it one of the first refinements of polished societies. As such, I am touched that one such as you would grace us with his presence." Alex immediately set his hide anything and everything about me plan into action by answering Sir Gilbert with some insignificant set-down. He had absolutely no idea what he had said, but Sir Gilbert seemed to take no offence, and went on to say he doubted not that he was adept in the science himself. And on and on and on they went with this pointless drabble of a conversation. Did he often dance at his beloved St. James's? Did he not think it would be a proper compliment to the place? No matter how vague the response, the old fool could not be silenced. "You have a house in town, I conclude?" asked the knight, in hopes of leading Alex into a new avenue of conversation. This time he chose to answer his wretched inquiries with a bow. Perhaps if he did not talk, the old fool would not talk. But there was no such luck. The man considered his bow sufficient encouragement, and continued on, saying something or other that Alex ignored, for he really did not want to know or care to know what Sir Littlefield spoke of, until, "My dear Miss Rose," Alex was immediately attentive, "why are you not dancing? Your Grace, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I am sure, when so much beauty is before you." So much beauty. The rosy blush that suffused her cheeks threatened to resurface all his provocative daydreams in a single moment. Already there was a fantasy in progress of the two of them gliding across the floor with eyes only for each other, feeling as if they were the only ones in the room. Though it completely defied the plan, Alex could not keep the little voice inside of him from yelling over and over, "God bless Sir Gilbert Littlefield." Here Sir Gilbert took Rose's hand to give it to Alex, who would have been most blissfully happy to receive it, had not the lady suddenly pulled it away with a cry of, "Indeed, sir, I do not have any intention of dancing. I beg you not to believe that I had moved this way in order to beg for a partner, least of all one who would flee the moment things become interesting." She did not wish to dance with him. In all the times he had asked a woman to dance, though that was a fairly small number, none had ever refused him, until now. And strangely, he quite liked that, but he still wished to dance with her. "Miss Marquis," he said in a quiet ardour as he offered her his hands, "would you do me the honour?" It seemed at first that she knew not how to answer his earnest request, but she was determined and firmly pressed her lips together before saying, "I thank you, sir, but I could not possibly." Not even Sir Gilbert's attempts at persuasion could move her. The old knight declared that Alex could have no objection, he was sure, to oblige them with a dance for 1/2 hour, at which she flashed said gentleman a saucy smile and replied, "The Major is all politeness." Something told him she was being sarcastic. Eventually she could take no more, and, only after archly raising her left eyebrow at Alex, walked away. Despite his disappointed feelings, he could not help but be satisfied as he watched her walk away from him, graceful and feisty all at the same time. She was unlike every other woman in the world, and that soon became one of the many things he loved about her. "I can guess the subject of your reverie." Sir Gilbert Littlefield's pestering presence had been replaced by Cordelia's. Lovely. But he would not allow Miss Watchtower to spoil his joy, and replied in a disinterested voice, "I should imagine not."
You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in such a manner in such society. Blah, 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 blah. Noise, 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 noise. Your conjecture, he replied, is totally wrong, I assure you. Or at least he assumed it was wrong, for he hadn't actually paid attention. He followed Rose's every move with his clear eyes as he continued on. My mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. When Miss Watchtower inquired what lady had the credit of inspiring such reflections, no doubt thinking it was herself, Alex slowly curved his lips into the smallest of smiles, as he answered with whole-hearted pride, Miss Rose Marquis.